Presentation 14, James Madison and the War of 1812. So we're going to continue our process of looking at the first 5 administrations. This is administration number 4. We've got one more in this series, so let's talk about James Madison and the major issue of his presidency, the War of 1812. So James Madison was elected the 4th president of the United States in 1808. He served 2 terms, 1809 to 1817, and he is the middle part of what's called the Virginia dynasty. You had 3 consecutive presidencies from members of Virginia, so citizens of Virginia. So you had Jefferson, then Madison, then Monroe. And foreign affairs are going to dominate Madison's presidency. And generally these are things that are held over from the first 3 administrations, problems with the French and the British. So nothing has changed. Both those major powers are still causing problems for the United States, and eventually this is going to spill over into war. So here's the election of 1808. You can see Madison wins fairly handily, though there was some opposition, even within his own party. George Clinton of New York was able to get 6 electoral college votes. So not everyone was sold on a James Madison presidency. Now, if you remember back to the Jefferson presidency, we had the Nonintercourse Act, where the United States would not trade with the French or the British, but it would trade with everyone else. This followed the Embargo Act. So in 1810, Nathaniel Macon of North Carolina proposed Macon's Bill No. 2, reopened trade with Britain and France. However, if either side were to revoke their restrictions on U.S. shipping, the U.S. would prohibit trade with the other. So if neither side revoked their restrictions, then non-intercourse would stay in effect. So what Macon is trying to do is force the United States to pick a side, whether it's going to be the British or the French. You have to pick one. We'll be a primary trading partner with that side, and then we won't trade with the other. Now, if both sides, if the British and the French, continue to be belligerent, then we're not going to trade with either still, and we'll just have non-intercourse. We'll trade with the Spanish or the Dutch or whoever else we were going to trade with. Now, France gets word of this, and Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the Emperor of France at this point, told his foreign minister to go to the United States and tell them that the French would trade with the United States. Now, he had no intention of doing so. Napoleon had something called the Continental System in Europe, where he had essentially closed off the entire continent to outside trade. But he was doing this because he wanted to harm the British, because he understood that if tensions between the British and the United States remained high, that would give him a better chance of doing what he wanted in Central Europe, because the British were his primary adversary in these very large coalitions that had been built around knocking Napoleon from power. So this is Napoleon's Deception. It really is a major cause of the War of 1812, because when Madison gets word that the French are going to do this, now again, they had no intention. When Madison gets word, he goes to Congress and asks for greater restrictions on British shipping. The British then, who had been considering revoking their trade restrictions on the United States, then blockade New York and impress American sailors. So now tensions are very high between the British and the United States. At the same time, you have problems on the frontier. Tecumseh, who was a Shawnee War Chief, refused to sign any treaties with the United States, and he was being funded and supplied by the British and encouraged to raid U.S. settlements. He was also out engaging in diplomacy with the southern tribes, notably the Creek Indians, to try to get them to rise up against the United States. So you've got this very powerful war chief, and this guy's a very good diplomat, very able warrior, on the frontier causing all kinds of problems, and the British are supplying him. So the United States has to do something about this. Now, his capital is at a place called Tippecanoe Creek. And we're talking about the Indiana Territory here. Sorry for the blurriness of the map, but we're talking about the Indiana Territory right here. Now, William Henry Harrison was the governor of the military governor of the Indiana Territory. He was well regarded as an Indian fighter. In fact, he was descended from the Harrison family. And the Harrisons, Benjamin Harrison, had signed the Declaration of Independence. So he came from Virginia originally, then was appointed military governor of Indiana. So from a very prominent Virginia family. In 1809, he signs a treaty with the Indian tribes called the Treaty of Fort Wayne, which essentially opened this area to American settlement. And Tecumseh refused to sign the treaty. So now he's got a direct confrontation with Tecumseh. And so Harrison decides in 1811 that he has to go out and take military action against this opposition force at Tippecanoe Creek. So this leads to what's called the Battle of Tippecanoe. Harrison and 1,000 men would attack the Shawnee capital. They would suffer very high casualties, but they would win. Now, Tecumseh was not there. He was actually in Alabama at that time, rallying the Creek Indians against the United States. But as these guys are kicking around the battlefield, they realized that they proved that these Indians had been supplied by the British because they were carrying British Brown Bess muskets. And so it's evident, here it is, clear that the British are behind all this. So this is going to lead to an increase in anti-British sentiment in the Old Northwest. Now, about this time, 1810, you had new faces entering Congress. These men are called the Warhawks. So this is the second generation of Americans now to enter public life. The first generation being the founding generation. Well, a lot of these guys are retiring, getting old. And so now you have this new generation, people like John C. Calhoun of South Carolina and Henry Clay of Kentucky. They're mostly from the West and the South, and they're very aggressive. They favor expansion. They're anti-British. They're generally nationalist. And they were outraged by the violations of American sovereignty and, of course, the Orders in Council, which were the British restrictions on U.S. trade. So they want action. Now, Madison, of course, being from the founding generation, he had already fought a war with the British in his lifetime. He's pursuing a much more cautious course. He asked Congress for an embargo against British goods, going back to that non-importation idea. Congress will agree, but then they'll also authorize or actually force the president to call up 100,000 men to start raising an army so they can potentially defeat the British. Madison will continue diplomacy with the British, but not long enough. Eventually he thinks that enough things have happened that he has to ask for a declaration of war. So on June 1st, 1812, Madison goes to Congress and asks Congress to declare war on Great Britain. He thinks there's enough evidence there to prove war is necessary, and so Congress will oblige him on 19 June, 1812. So this is the beginning of the War of 1812. The United States declares war on Britain, not the other way around. What were our advantages in this war? Well, Britain could not send the bulk of her forces to America because she was worried about fighting France. So the British army is divided at this time. The U.S. population was far superior to Canada, which was our closest British rival. And the United States Navy had good, well-trained officers and crews, though fewer ships. They were first-class warships. So those are the advantages. You can see there's not a whole lot there. In fact, our disadvantages were much more pronounced. So the United States had a small and badly administered regular army. It didn't really have popular support, particularly in the North, where they labeled this war Mr. Madison's War. And this bordered on treason, in fact. And the U.S. government finances were not stable, and the government had to borrow large sums of money to fight the war. So we've got financial problems, administration problems, support problems. So it doesn't really look good that the United States is going to win this war. Now, there are several theaters of operation. You can see the northern theater up here. And then there's what I call the southern theater. You have these two areas here in Alabama primarily, and then into Louisiana. And then you also have in Maryland. So let's talk about the northern theater first. You can see that a lot of fighting takes place on the Great Lakes. And if you've never been to the Great Lakes, these are like big oceans out in the middle of the continent. The United States really didn't offer much resistance early in this war. In fact, they surrendered Detroit in July of 1812 without really firing a shot. And there were disastrous battles in Canada. So early American success is going to hinge on the Navy. And the United States Navy does a pretty good job. In fact, in August of 1812, the USS Constitution will defeat the HMS Guerriere. The Guerriere is destroyed in the action, this is a major victory for the United States because the United States Navy doesn't defeat British warships. I mean, that just doesn't happen. But this showed you how good the American warships were at the time and how good our Navy was. However, you also had a fairly disastrous naval engagement in June of 1813. The USS Chesapeake was defeated and captured by the HMS Shannon. This is a very bloody engagement. It's most remembered for Captain James Lawrence's famous phrase, "Don't give up the ship," after he was mortally wounded, and there was a boarding action. A very bloody battle. In fact, in the Age of Sail, this is probably the pinnacle of the type of combat you would see in the Age of Sail. It involved raking the deck, firing cannons across the deck, which of course just blew people to smithereens. Knocking out the rudder of the ship so they can't move. The captain of the Shannon was also wounded very severely. He had a cutlass knocked through his head down to his brain, but he survived. Lawrence was shot in the groin, and he died from those wounds. But the United States would give up the ship. Now, you think about naval battles, they last a long time. This battle lasted about 11 minutes, and it was over. Very intense combat for 11 minutes. Now, 1812 is an election year, of course. The war has already begun, and then there's an election in November. And Madison's going to win again, but you can see there's not a whole lot of support up in New England. Now, there would be a very decisive American victory on the Great Lakes, the Battle of Lake Erie or Put-in Bay. This was a decisive victory. The United States won a major victory of the British Navy here. And Oliver Perry, who was the commander of the naval forces there, famously wrote after the battle, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." It's also in 1813 that William Henry Harrison will engage the British and Indian forces at the Battle of the Thames. Tecumseh, in fact, will be killed in this battle. It's rumored that Harrison did the honor himself. And this ends the Indian alliance in the Old Northwest and makes Harrison a national hero. He will use this to his advantage, and the Whigs will use this to their advantage. We'll talk about the Whigs later on when Harrison is elected president in 1840. So let's look at the Southern theater. So here's Tippecanoe, of course, right here. But let's look at the Southern theater. So Maryland, and then, of course, Alabama and Louisiana, Mississippi area. This is all part of what's called the Creek War. You actually had a civil war in the Creek tribe, the Red Sticks against the White Sticks. The very first engagements were the Battle of Burnt Corn and the massacre at Fort Mims. Fort Mims, the Red Sticks believed the White Sticks were at Fort Mims, were helping American forces, and so they attack the fort and they kill everyone inside. So this is pretty brutal warfare. So the White Sticks generally were those who favored, or at least were more sympathetic to the United States. The Red Sticks were completely against it, and the Red Sticks are being influenced by Tecumseh. Andrew Jackson is asked to march south. Now, he's not alone. There are others, General Wilkinson, for example. But he's asked to march south and handle the situation. He really becomes an American hero during the War of 1812. He's going to win the Creek War. He's going to win the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which is the major engagement of the Creek War. That should say 1814, excuse me, on that date. So the Battle of Horseshoe Bend is 1814, not 1812. The Battle of Horseshoe Bend took place not far from in Phoenix City, about an hour north of here, northwest sort of. And what happened? I mean, it's called Horseshoe Bend. There's a river that forms a horseshoe shape in this peninsula almost, and so the Creeks will barricade themselves on this peninsula, and the United States Army will shoot through it and then massacre the Indians. They'll actually have soldiers on the other side of the river too, so as the Indians are trying to run across the river, they're shot there as well. So 1814 was a year of mixed results. You have Americans winning major victories at Horseshoe Bend, Chippewa, and Pittsburgh, and also Baltimore, but the British would occupy and burn Washington, D.C. in 1814. So it used to be thought that in the 19th century, if you occupy and burn the enemy capital, you win the war. Well, the United States didn't give up, but this is a major disaster. The White House is burned, the Capitol building is burned. In fact, Madison has to take command of an artillery battery that has to retreat. This is the last time in American history that a sitting president takes fire on the battlefield. But what happens, the Americans don't dislodge the British, but the day after the battle, there's a line of thunderstorms that moves through D.C. And there's, of course, the rain will put out the fires, but there's also an EF4 tornado that blows through the British camp, which terrifies them, so they all get out of there. So it's a tornado that actually dislodges the British, not the Americans themselves. It's also in 1814 that you have the Battle of Baltimore at Fort McHenry. This is a major American victory. The United States is going to win, defeat the British Navy. And, of course, there's an American on a prison barge named Francis Scott Key who watches the battle, and he pens down a poem entitled The Star-Spangled Banner, which eventually, of course, becomes a national anthem of the United States. 1814 is, in fact, the year the war ends, at least diplomatically, because in December of 1814 you have the Treaty of Ghent signed between the United States and the British. No major issues were addressed. It was simply a ceasefire and a prisoner exchange, but this ended the War of 1812, at least diplomatically. However, the war would continue militarily, because the last major battle occurs after the treaty is signed. This is in January of 1815. Andrew Jackson is around New Orleans, and he's going to repel a much larger British force. He had actually thought that the chances of victory were pretty slim, so before the battle he goes to he stops at a Catholic nunnery and prays with the nuns there. The nuns were part of a group who was dedicated to Our Lady of Prompt Succor. And every time Jackson was back in New Orleans then, even though he wasn't Catholic, he always stopped and prayed with these nuns because he thought this really brought him victory on the battlefield. This elevates Jackson to a national hero. In fact, there are 71 Americans killed or wounded. There are 2,036 British killed, wounded, and captured. So it's a major victory for the United States. Now, during the war itself, there was actually a call for secession, the secession of New England, and the nullification of laws in support of the war. This is called the Hartford Convention. In fact, they issued a statement closely resembling the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions. This called for a series of constitutional amendments, for example, prohibition of trade embargoes that lasted over 60 days, 2/3 majority for admitting new states or declaring war because they're afraid these new states carved out of any territory. Of course, the Louisiana Purchase are going to be voting Jeffersonian. They wanted to remove the Three-Fifths Compromise of the Constitution because, of course, that gives the South more power. They wanted a one-term limit for president, and that required the president to be from a different state than his predecessor. So they're upset with the political system in the United States. It's very clear that they understand that they are a minority section right now, and what they want to do is help knock down the power of the South. But this really discredited the Federalist Party because by the time these resolutions are introduced, the war is essentially over, and the Federalist Party is going to fall apart because of this. Now, it's important to note, though, that the first discussion of secession in the early federal period was in the North, not the South. So it's ironic that just 50 years later, Northerners are calling Southerners traitors, committing treason, when the North advocated the same thing 50 years before. Now, some other issues during the Madison administration. The first Bank of the United States failed recharter in 1811, so the second Bank of the United States was established in 1816. So for 5 years, the United States did not have a central banking system. A lot of people thought that was one of the major problems with the U.S. economy. Though when the bank is implemented, there's a disaster with that too. So, well, during the war, they didn't have the financial means necessary to necessarily prosecute the war. So this is seen as a problem. So the Congress would pass the second Bank of the United States, and Madison would sign it into law. And this is really interesting because the first bank was passed by the Congress. Madison argued in 1791 the bank was unconstitutional. So now he's signing it. He's president, and he's signing it into law. And they asked him, he was pressed on this. Well, wait, I thought you said just about 20 years ago the bank wasn't constitutional. He said, well, times have changed. But nothing had changed in the Constitution. So Madison was being very inconsistent here. But he also vetoed something called the bonus bill. This would have taken the extra money that was there for chartering the bank and spent it on internal improvements, federally funded internal improvements, things that are necessary for the infrastructure of the United States. Well, Madison's going to veto that. And he says, look, there's nothing in the Constitution that says we can build roads, for example. So he's vetoing one piece of legislation because there's nothing in the Constitution that says you can do it, yet he's signing another piece of legislation when nothing in the Constitution says you can do it. So he's being very inconsistent. Now, the Madison presidency really was defined by the War of 1812. He supported the Bank of the United States, but not the bonus bill, though relations with Great Britain were normalized. But really, the war could have been avoided. And you're starting to see sectional strife again. So you've got the Hartford Convention, the North saying the South is dominating the government, we want out. This is going to be some development to a major problem as we move into the Monroe administration. Okay, so that's it for presentation 14. We'll see